Welcome to the 1619 Project discussion. My name is Antonio Ruiz, and my partner in crime over here. Oh no, you're not a criminal. You're no,
not yet.
Not yet. Thomas Fields.
Hey, Antonio.
We might be. So we've been, as well as you know, been talking about discussing various chapters of the 1619 Project. Today we're going to cover fear, which is an interesting subject, considering what's been happening over the last few years, or the last 250 years, if you want to go back. I want to open up with a passage on page 92, and it's one of these facts, historical facts that they spread throughout the book. And it refers to 1773, a publishing house in London releases poems on various subjects, that's the title, religious and moral, by Phyllis Wheatley. She was a 20-year-old enslaved woman in Boston, making her the first African-American to publish a book of poetry. Wheatley was captured in West Africa when she was 7 years old. Her first name was derived from the ship that took her across the Atlantic Ocean. Her last name belonged to the prominent Boston family who purchased her. After a book is published, Wheatley is freed, but the remainder of her life is marked by poverty and illness. And then on the next page, it's actually part of a poem, but I won't read the entire poem. I just want to read the beginning, the quote from Thomas Jefferson, notes on the state of Virginia. Among the Blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism.
That's good.
Thomas Jefferson, by the way.
That's good.
You know who he is, right now.
No.
Excuse me, I'm always amazed. I have to talk about this. When you go to the website for Mount Vernon, which was, of course, his plantation or forced labor camp, as some of us are beginning to describe them. And in other places, they make a big deal about, well, yes, he owned all these slaves, but plus the fact he had one as a mistress. And God knows how many else that he may not have had as a mistress, but that he had relations with. They make a big deal about he had second thoughts about slavery, particularly after his presidency. But yet the reality is that slaves were not freed until after he died. And even then, I guess his wife did keep some for some time. I'll need to double check that, but I'm pretty sure that that's what happened. And yet, we just have this thing in this country of we excuse all of this, whether it was the other 13 or 12 presidents who had slaves, or the 1,500 members of Congress who had slaves, and we excuse it by saying things like, ranging from, well, you had to be there in that time. You had to understand the cultural context. Now, mind you, they don't go out of their way to contextualize so many other things, particularly when it's done by people of color. I just had to say that because I think it's a good introduction to this chapter on fear. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I just briefly, on this whole thing of contextualizing. I was reading the New York Times this morning, and they were talking about artwork that's going back to Greece. And the phrase that was used by the New York Times writer was artwork that was thought to be stolen is being returned to Greece. And that's an interesting phrase, thought to be stolen. It was stolen, but you have to sort of qualify that with thought. There's no question about it. And I think the same thing can be true of what you said. You know, it's like if you contextualize, so you can. I think we in this country too often contextualize when it's the dominant thinking, a dominant group that does it. We contextualize it. We don't contextualize it when it has to do with people of color doing things. It's always looked at in the stark, cold light of day.
Yeah.
And I just thought that word thought to be stolen. And I suppose you could say one thing of stolen.
It's funny because there's examples in this chapter called Fear, where white Americans are allowed to do certain things, but if Black Americans did the same things, it'd be a whole different context.
Of course.
You know. Let me just read this opening paragraph and then we can go from there. And it says, on May 25th, 2020, a Black man named George Floyd was forced to the ground by several Minneapolis police officers. He remained there pinned for more than 9 minutes as Officer Derek Chauvin, pressed his knee into Floyd's neck, killing him slowly even as he begged for his life and called out to his dead mother. Just a short time before, a clerk at a convenience store had called 911, claiming that Floyd had purchased cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill. Minutes after the police arrived on the scene, Floyd was dead. Speaking of contextualizing, and if you see social media particularly, or for instance, even Fox News or any number of right-wing networks, they always start with, well, yeah, but he was stealing something, or he was he was passing off counterfeit bills, or, I mean, there's always this kind of like, yeah, but we had to kill him. I mean, yes, it's tragic that he died, but he caused his own death. And it's this, I mean, I remember in the very first days of when people started using the words Black Lives Matter, the surprise, I wasn't surprised where a lot of the backlash was coming from. What I was so surprised about was people who I thought were progressive, maybe not progressive, but liberal, starting to say, well, you know, really, it's all lives matter. Anytime we say something that relates to the oppression of any group of people of color, but particularly Black people in this context, America just can't handle just saying, yeah, that's wrong. No, we have to contextualize it. Well, yeah, you know, he caused it, or, you know, if he hadn't resisted. Let me start off there.
I'll leave you with two thoughts, both of which will be brief. One of the things is we theoretically have a system in place where the police cannot be the judge and jury. And whenever you see that kind of behavior, regardless of what an individual has done, and a policeman shoots a person or basically brutalizes that person, it goes under the fact of judge and jury. That's not the way the system was set up to work. Maybe this is the way it's set up to work, but it's not the way it's mythologized to work. So that's when that part and parcel in that. And then this other thing, it's kind of funny. I was thinking about, we've talked a great deal about the ill-advised words to fund the police. And I've had some new thoughts about that. And here's where they kind of come down to. While we are asking cities to defund the police, Republicans and the rich are quietly defunding the IRS to stiff and shift the tax burden to the working class and the middle class. Now, I mean, that's defunding the IRS.
Yeah, no, you're right.
They've done it.
Good point.
So
Good
to
point.
me, when you start talking about how defund the police is this somehow villainous thing, oh, excuse me, the Republicans are defunding the damn IRS. And that's to me, in many ways.
And not only the IRS, but defunding a hell of a lot of social beneficial.
But I can see that, but that is the bedrock upon which this nation is based. And that's in the collecting of our taxes for our greater common good. When you have one group, particularly the 1%ers, and particularly those corporations of which we discussed, there's something like, I think, out of Fortune 500, I believe I got this number right, 30 of them paid no tax. And those are 30 of the largest ones. That's not even injustice, that's villainous. And when you start to me, so I don't want to hear anything further about the defunding of police being something which is villainous. It's something of which is un-American. I can't think of anything more un-American than defunding the IRS.
There's an article I gotta find this. I saw it really quickly, dealing with when Biden. I didn't hear this particular line, but when he said something about fully funding the police or something like that,
Biden.
He got a round of applause from both the Republicans and the Democrats. And so there was a piece, and I've got to find it. It was either in the Washington Post or the New York Times that said, funding the police, they're not going broke.
True.
They make up a large percentage of the budgets in many cities. In Long Beach is every city. Long Beach is over 50%.
Yeah.
Then the thing that always kills me is you read when they, particularly in Long Beach, they do this thing where they publish the salaries, which actually you can find.
Yes.
There's a website where you can find the salaries of public employees, and always near the top, alongside, the mayors or the city managers of cities, you will find police and fire people, many of whom get there because of overtime.
Precisely.
And overtime, which is like, I'm not saying people don't earn it, but I find it just interesting.
Well, I can tell you,
find those numbers.
In this city, I can speak to this directly. The overtime system has been abused. Not only in this city, look in LA, it's been abused, been proven to be abused. We have, I know for a fact in LA, one of the captains, the fire department, does not live in the city. In fact, that person lives in Midland, Texas. He flies up here because he only works, I think it's 4 days a week or 3 days a week. He flies up here and to put in his work, and it flies back home. And that is not that uncommon. And public safety has somehow managed to get these unions that are often stronger than the politicians that are there to supposedly, pardon the pun, police them.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, to me, it's not just a straw man, this whole thing about funding the police, defunding the police. It is basically calling black white and white black.
Yeah.
It's George Orwellian. And they've been getting away with it for years, decades, and they probably will continue to get away with it until people come to the realization that there is nothing in their best interest in regarding this kind of funding for an organization which has destroyed neighborhoods?
The reactions during the summer of social justice, I just, this is in keeping with this chapter on fear. Yes, there were riots in the street, but now you and I both have lived long enough that we've seen innumerable, whether you want to call them insurrections or, I hate the word riots, especially nowadays because it's hard. Riots imply a certain, yes, there are people who loot, and then there are people who are just so angry that they take an action to protest something. I remember the dispute in the 60s between people, the people who were advocating nonviolent action, and then the people who decided that, you know what, I can only get beaten so often before I need to strike back, which was always then an invitation for more violence against them. There's a paragraph here I need to read to just sort of also as we move forward through this chapter. And they're talking about the difference between the summer of social justice when there were demonstrations around this country. And for instance, one line here, of the more than 7,700 demonstrations that took place in the United States between May 26th and August 22nd. This is, 2019, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, 2020, excuse me. This was the year that George Floyd got killed.
Right.
That there were, between the May 26th and August 22nd, nearly 95% were nonviolent, according to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. Fewer than 220 locations reported any form of violent demonstrations. In the tally, the term was defined to include any acts of vandalism, including graffiti and toppling of statues, property destruction, or violence of any kind against individuals. And we know what happened. The police came through. Donald Trump was, practically called out the army. But fortunately, some people, a lot of people stopped him. But those same troops that were called out, for instance, I'm talking about the National Guard in New York City and in other states, were nowhere to be found later when an overwhelmingly white mob composed of white nationalists and Trump supporters stormed the United States Capitol.
Yes.
The glaring double standard reflects a centuries-old pattern in which Blacks striving for liberation have been demonized, criminalized, and subjected to persecution, while white people's demands for liberty are deemed rational, legitimate, and largely unthreatening. As James Baldwin explained a half century earlier, when any white man in the world says, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death," the entire white world applauds. When a Black man says exactly the same thing, word for word, he is judged a criminal and treated like one, and everything possible is done to make an example of this bad, using the N-word, so there won't be any more like him, unquote.
Yeah. The truth of the matter is, I am not anti-police. What I asked for is that the neighborhoods, all neighborhoods, Black and white neighborhoods, have the same number of cops that they put in the Black neighborhoods or brown neighborhoods. As we see for drugs, it's documented that whites and Blacks and browns use drugs about the same proportion. Yet, those who are prosecuted those that are jailed are overwhelmingly people of color. There's no secret to why that is. One has to do with the fact that when that law of the war on drugs was devised by Richard Nixon, he intended and said it in his tapes. It was to go against the leftists and blacks, who he thought were his enemy. And that's fact. The fact that you also throw in large numbers of armed police into these communities and devastate them, because what they did was arrested males, primarily, send them off. You destroy the family structure. You combine that with all kinds of renewal, for everything from putting highways through the communities. That's a recipe for social unrest. All I ask is, if you're going to put cops in one neighborhood, put the same number of cops in the other neighborhood and see what happens. It's a simple request.
I have to tell you, there are some white suburban neighborhoods who would love to have a lot of cops to protect them from, those outsiders.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that they're not asking for the same kind of treatment by those police.
But on the other hand, those neighborhoods and the residents in them perceive police as being their protectors.
Right.
What happens, and this is typical of any kind of organization in which you have enforcement. People enforcing certain rules tend to elevate themselves. And regardless of the nationality of the people that they're enforcing, now they may come down harder on people of color because of background, but there's going to be violations of their rights. That is a fact. And when they go in large numbers, you're going to see that increase. If I just say, put the same numbers into these safe white neighborhoods and see what happens, you won't see it.
Yeah, and I want to even go further. Not just it's a question of having. See, this is the thing that nobody talks about. Okay, we need more cops. See that everywhere. I want to know, what is it that they're expected to do?
Cops,
police, and what are they trained for?
Well, that's a question.
And what are they liable for? And what, look, the reality is that, and I don't know, there only seems to be one segment of Americans who are talking about this, is, I've known police officers all my life.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was in New York, Washington, D.C., Hartford, Connecticut, L.A., here in Long Beach. I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that all police officers that I've ever met are the baddest people on the face of the earth.
No, certainly not.
But what I am saying is, and some of them have told me point blank, is, look, our job is to go in there. I will never forget this conversation I had with two undercover guys, not undercover, they were plain clothes, young guys. They call themselves the Mod Squad, for those of us who are too young to know who that is. It was a TV show in the 60s. And they told me point blank, listen, we don't know who the bad guys are. So we got to treat everybody as if they're the bad guy. And I said,
unfortunately,
well, that makes no sense.
No, of course not.
I said, well, you just don't know. If you go, this is in DC, if you go east of 18th Street, or 14th Street, you don't know what we deal with day in and day out.
Let me get.
And this is the worst part about it was, this was a young, I will always remember this. One guy was Black, one guy was Latino.
Sure.
And this is because they're they're reacting to a culture
Yes.
that they're part of.
But let me put that. We start this conversation talking about context. Let me put that in the context, because I grew up in D.C.
Yeah, yeah.
I know a bit about that town.
This is early 70s.
Yeah, right. From many facets. So you mentioned 14th Street, you mentioned 18th Street, east of 18th Street. In those days, don't go east of 18th Street. Don't go on to 14th Street. It's Desperado Land. I like to present to you today, east of 18th Street. East of 18th Street today is very, very middle class, upper middle class.
Yeah, yeah.
Predominantly white. I like to present to you 14th Street. 14th Street today is the hub of fine dining and nightclubs. Now, no cop will say that today. What changed? Well, and it wasn't that long ago. What changed?
More white people.
Well, yeah, but how did more white people get there? And how did the circumstances change so that more white people got there? And I will say this because I saw it happening in Washington, D.C. So and what gets us back to this thing of funding the police. So in Washington, D.C., they never put money into those communities. Right. In fact, they drain those communities of resources. And human resources, as I mentioned before, in arresting people, they often stop services or make services, such as the picking up of refuse, garbage collection, made that haphazard. They didn't invest in the roads. They sure as hell didn't invest in infrastructure. And so what you had was an area that nobody lived in except those who were desperate. The moment that property became viable, or they wanted to become viable to developers, what do? They started investing in it. And guess what? Where people who could not get bank loans and insurance previously because they were Black and brown, guess what happened? Suddenly and magically, mortgages began happening. Yeah. Redlining went away. Now that cop that says, I don't want to go east of 18th Street is happy to go east of 18th Street. He would love to live there if he could afford it.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that is how the system works in this country. And and you talked about we're going to reduce the system of capitalism. You can't talk about slavery. You can't talk about mass incarceration. You can't talk about what is happening today without talking about capitalism, because it's at the root of it.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I've been, I finished, as I told you, we were studying a book called The Marrow of Tradition, a novel written by, published in 1901, based on a 1898, incident in North Carolina, where basically white people overthrew a government of Black and white.
Duly elected government.
Duly elected Democratic government, and basically tried to burn out all Black people from that town. This idea of fear, going back to the first slaves that were brought here, this idea of fear that they were just scared of, particularly after the revolt, the slave rebellion in Haiti, where the French were kicked out and where slaves took over government. Thomas Jefferson spoke about, he was acutely aware, as one paragraph says here, that Black people yearned for freedom no less than the white colonists who had waged the American Revolution, and that no principle of justice could defend slavery. Mind you, here's the guy who owned hundreds of slaves. He admitted that rebellions were a legitimate, rational response to an immoral and inhumane system. But, however, they did everything possible to make sure that any rebellions that did happen were squashed or instilled enough fear in enslaved people that they would not revolt. because they were fearful that they might revolt, that their lives would be, I'm talking about white slavers, some slave holders. It says here one thing that from the founding of the original 13 colonies, white people in the North and South lived in constant fear that the men and women they whipped, raped, and forced to work without pay would, if given the chance, rise up and take revenge on their white enslavers. This is why governmental surveillance and severe punishment of Black people began almost concurrently with the introduction of slavery itself. In 1669, the Carolina colony granted every free white man absolute power and authority, this is in quotes, over his Negro slaves, unquote. So it was really crazy. I mean, this is like this kind of Alice in Wonderland thing where, we fear that they're going to rebel, so we're going to whip them, beat them, so that they fear rising up against our fear.
Well, Antonio, how do you explain the fear?
And this happens. This I wish we could just say, well, this just happened only in the 17th century and the 18th century. This happens today.
Well, my question to you is, how do you explain the fear that is today? And let's back it up a little bit. After the slaves were, or enslaved people were given their freedom, or maybe I should say fought for their freedom, and they attained their freedom, what is the fear that drove whites to lynch them, to do everything in their power to keep free Black people with ambition, free Black people who had desire to raise themselves into middle class, to have self-rule? What was the fear that drove whites to burn them out? That's a different kind of fear. I assume it's a different kind of fear than the fear that they would rise up when they were slaves and drive them out. I mean, you have to somehow figure out, what is that fear? Is that fear attached to that? Because they're no longer, quote unquote, a threat. They're certainly not a threat to them, to rebellion, because now, quote unquote, they're free. How do you define that fear? And that fear that continues today, that will have a white woman in Central Park, or for that matter, a white woman in the Bay Area, who believes that she somehow or another, when confronted with a Harvard-educated, I think it was Harvard or Yale, educated Black who's asked her to leash her dog.
Right.
She feels somehow or another fear that she's going to be attacked. What is the fear that has a white woman who calls the police on a child selling water outside of a condo? I mean, that's the fear that I today don't quite understand. Or I can't rationalize that fear away. I can sort of rationalize the fear that your slave killing you in the night.
Yeah, but we've talked about this before. As you get along in this chapter, 120, 121 page, you start to realize things that range from the 1994 crime bill, what happened when Obama was elected, and the rise of the Tea Party. There's a paragraph, a line here, considering this history of stop and frisk and surveillance tactics, this idea of the angry white men, this idea of that somehow the advancement of people of color, or in this case, we're talking about Black people, is a threat somehow to white people in this country. And there's a line here that it says, it should have come as no surprise. This is on page 121. It should have come as no surprise that the election of the first Black president and anxiety over shifting racial demographics due to immigration, including a widely publicized projection that white people will be a racial minority by the mid-21st century, would be followed by a rise in white nationalism, hate crimes, and vigilante violence, as well as an election of politicians like Donald Trump, a man who rose to power by exploiting racial fears and divisions and sought to maintain power by thwarting democracy. Excuse me. It's pathological. I mean, it's like what is it? You're right. I mean, how is this taking anything away from you? But
that's explained. That can be explained.
Well, no, it has been explained. Yeah, go ahead, please.
And explain only in the sense that, and I hate to use these sort of outdated terms, but they do illustrate it quickly. The ruling class has convinced the working white class that their currency is their skin.
Right.
And it also becomes a
not class.
No, it's not. No, because we don't have class in this country. Of course not. No, we have money money and race in this country. That substitutes for class here. But what the ruling class has convinced the white working class that their skin happens to be a safety net. And that's the only way to look at it. Their skin is a safety net, preventing them from falling to that level, which they deem Hades. Okay, and that's really what I think. And also my own personal belief is that racism of that nature is a mental defect. It's not just pathological. It's a mental disease. I mean, it should be, I believe it's the MDS, it should be defined as a mental disease. I mean, if you recall, not very long ago, homosexuality was defined as a mental disease,
right.
Which was taken out. I believe it should be replaced with racism, frankly, because there is no other explanation for what we see in this, something that's proven to be nothing more than a social construct.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that I was listening this morning to the New York Times podcast, and they had visited, in light of the recent primary there, they were visiting a congressional district, or actually two congressional districts, back to back, next to each other, who were, had, before this new gerrymandering, I forget, there were like four, solidly Democratic congressional districts. There's now 5.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are now 7 solidly Republican districts, and there are no more contested districts, or districts that are toss-ups. And one of the things that they were talking about when you listen to these folks who are talking about, rhinos, and why are they right now? Mind you, they're talking about somebody I would think I would just find as far right, but no, they're not far right enough.
Yeah.
And, they keep talking about, Trump and, the election was stolen. But underneath it, it's really like they're hanging on to this idea of their vision of America. And their idea of America being a white America, an America that deals with, immigration more harshly, that deals with crime, that's a consistent issue that keeps coming up. Well, you know who they're talking about. And it just, I just think that it's really almost irrational, because when the Times reporter would ask them for a specific reason why they hated this rhino, they couldn't come up with anything. They just know that they hate that person. They just know that this person is not, and this is a Republican they're talking about. We won't even talk about what they said about Democrats. It's like, there's nothing rational about these arguments anymore. They're just, we know that they're bad because we're told they're bad.
How
where have we seen this before?
Yeah, I was going to say, how different is this from what, for example, propaganda during the era of Nazis, where they talked about Jews.
Yeah.
It is irrational. It has no basis in fact or reality. But as long as you get people whipped up to scapegoat another group or another person, many people follow that. It's a path of least resistance. And I just guess there's some people that will always look for another person or group to blame for their own inadequacies. That seems to be something embedded in many people's psyche.
Yeah, I know we touched a little bit on this book, The Marrow Tradition, and I was just looking through and reminding myself there's a passage in there where these white conspirators they call themselves the Big Three, of where they were plotting to take over the local government. And one of them was a newspaper publisher. And he made it very clear that he was going to use his newspaper to foment rebellion from the white population in this town. And as I was reading that chapter again, it sounds so much like the right-wing media in this country today. It didn't even matter that the guy was either exaggerating or just writing up lies to be able to whip up these folks. It's no different between that, and we're talking about late 19th century and today. When you listen to, everybody's talking about, all of a sudden, by the way, Fox News has become pro-Ukrainian. I find that so interesting, because they finally realized, oops, might be on the wrong side here.
Yeah, step too far.
They'll take an issue and just turn it around completely, so that not only can they use it against Biden, but this idea that the only solution is to install more Republicans and their kind of Republicans into office. And I just...
I look, something, I look at
it's all part of that whole...
Yeah,
we have to justify fear and still fear of something, of someone, like you said, making them the scapegoat.
It's part of an old playbook. It's out of their old playbook. I look at what's happening now with Fox and a number of the authoritarian right-wingers as wonderful, because they jumped on the Putin bandwagon early. Putin was brilliant. Putin was this. And they really went against the Ukrainians and their own best interests in this country. And now they're having to backtrack. I think that this is going to be helpful in the future, particularly in the near future with the midterms, because it's already created some cleavages in the Republican Party. And this is a party, if you remember, that was so anti-communist, that, integration was a communist threat. And suddenly now they are on the side of an authoritarian. I guess Putin is not a communist any longer.
Right.
Yeah, I guess he's nothing more than an authoritarian figure who has basically raped and pillaged his own country.
Right.
But I think it's going to be extremely useful to the Democrats to keep playing this back, playing Fox and their support of Putin in the early days.
Well, I hope that they adopt that philosophy, but I don't have a lot of faith in the Democratic infrastructure. I mean, I just look at the party I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I just keep looking at every day who dominates the narrative. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about right-wing media here. You would expect that. I'm talking about the more quote-unquote moderate, middle of the road, mm-hmm. Media who just can't help themselves and think that there's two sides to Trumpism, and we need to we criticize Trump, but we really, and I'm not talking about the role of a journalist should not be a propaganda arm like Fox. But it just seems sometimes they just can't help themselves, that they whether they're talking about latest employment numbers or they're talking about some action, they just seem to find the need to take this negative track and then turn it around so that becomes the dominant narrative. And it's sort of the same thing with the 1619 Project. I just saw, there's going to be critics of this, I'm sure. There are critics.
There already are.
So-called historians or people who say they're historians. But as I'm reading this book, I'm realizing, and we're coming to a close here, but I'm realizing that there's so many things in here that as I've said before, that I know because I've learned them in whether it's history class or whether I learned them by reading or I learned them, by watching some documentary, that the reality is that we as a country have not come to terms with our past, and that we keep trying to hide it and only look at those things that will make us look good to ourselves or relieve us of the guilt. Not that I think people feel guilt by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't think it should. I'm not asking people to go, I'm going to be feel sorry or feel guilty for something that maybe an ancestor did. That's not the point. The point is you can't, on the one hand, claim, okay, I like this part of American history because it makes me feel good. Right. And I don't want to talk about this part of history because it makes me feel bad. You can't pick and choose it. It's your American history. If you're going to claim that this is your America, then you got to accept it for what it is. But more importantly, then talk about what's happening today, because what's happening today is just a continuation of that American history. My closing.
Can I just
in your close? Yes, please.
Can I leave with an upbeat note?
Oh God, here we go again. Stop with your optimism.
I'm gonna leave it on an optimistic note. I say, thank God that authoritarians always overstep and overreach. Be they Putin or be they right-wing Republicans, you can count on one thing. They're freaking gonna overreach. And when they overreach, they usually get snared and they usually get their fingers caught. I think the same thing, you're seeing it play out now in Ukraine. I think you're seeing it play out in this country. They can't help themselves. This whole thing about basically anti-abortion, the whole thing about LGBT kids. I mean, or God forbid, a virus. I mean, illustration, DeSantis, Friday.
Oh my God.
At a press conference.
That's
kids
hard.
Behind him, high school kids wearing masks. He snaps at them. That's an example of that authoritarian bent that steps, if you step out of line, I'm coming at you. That will not play well on a campaign hit piece. Now, will it be enough to swing forward? I hope so. But but I can just say, you can count on them to do that. And that's my optimistic note.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Thomas. See you next week.
Antonio, see you then.